and begin. Let me just do my quick intro bumper here. So much for that. Don Jans, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Great to be with you again.
So Don, you've written yet another book. You're very prolific as an author. Let's go right to it. It's Setting Brushfires of Freedom. There we go. Talk a little bit about that and about Samuel Adams, from whom you derive the title of your book.
First of all, I came about this idea. I go out and do talks. I love to go out and do talks. Talk about who America is, what we are, the threats that are coming against us. And invariably, the question I would receive is, well, what do we do? And I would go to what Samuel Adams said a week ago. Now, who is Samuel Adams? You know him very well. You live quite close to where he lived.
Yes,
most
in
American
Boston.
people don't truly understand the significance that Samuel Adams had on our revolution. I dare say, if it had not been for Samuel Adams, we probably really wouldn't have that much information on George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, or the rest. Samuel Adams is the father of the American Revolution. Commonly called that, was claimed to be that by many people.
Yes.
And Samuel Adams did not give up. He had one goal, and that goal was American freedom. And that is what he always had in his mind. And there were difficult times, as you know, there were very difficult times in the 1760s and 1770s. Samuel Adams made the statement. He said, it does not take a majority to prevail. It takes an irate, tireless minority keen on setting brushfires of freedom in the minds of men. And that's how the book came about, and that's the basis of the book that I wrote, Setting Brushfires of Freedom.
Don, how would you compare the rallies, the protests, the street actions of Samuel Adams back in colonial times in Boston? And by the way, he worked very closely with his cousin, John Adams, who sort of played the straight man, if you will. He kind of was, took the cases in the lawsuit, in the courtroom, and he set a landmark precedent when he defended the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre. This was very shocking at the time. How could he do this, defend these murderers? And he laid out in very clear terms that in this country, or in a system of law, everyone has a right to a defense, and that he would present that defense in the best way he could. Moving the fact that we are not ruled by mobs, ultimately, we are ruled by laws, not by men, as Thomas Jefferson said. And yet, as I say, he worked closely with his cousin who was out there with mobs. How would you compare the mob approach of Samuel Adams to the Antifa today, who are burning and looting minority neighborhoods predominantly and killing Black people predominantly in America's cities?
A couple of things on that. The first thing I'd like to say is, let's take a look at the Boston Tea Party. Boston Tea Party was really a very, very, very instrumental incident in the history and how we came about to have a revolution, because it brought on the Intolerable Acts, which really brought on our first American Continental Congress, which led to the second, which led to the Declaration of Independence, and then consequently to Cornwallis surrendering to Washington. So the Boston Tea Party was an extremely important factor in our independence. And let's not forget that when they went, and how much did Samuel Adams really have to do with this? I think we can comfortably say that he was very much involved.
Oh yeah.
And that when he closed that meeting, that was the signal, let's go. And what did they do? They went down to those 3 ships in the Boston Harbor. They threw all the tea overboard. They did 0 damage to the ships. They did zero damage to any of the other cargo on those ships. They didn't loot other people's property. They only attacked the team.
Right.
Now, if I could carry that one step further, they did this to bring about the freedom and liberty of the individual. They did this to curtail and to end the tyranny of the British government and the British king. Barack Obama yesterday said these protests that we're having today are like the American Revolution. Never, ever could he be more wrong. The American Revolution was a revolution. It was not a protest. The Boston Tea Party was a protest. The Boston Tea Party was a very, very orderly protest. The revolution was a revolution. We shot people for the purpose of winning our individual freedom and liberty, where the comrades of today, the Obamas, the BLM, Antifa, their concern is to end those liberties, to end those freedoms, and once again bring about tyranny of government. So I would say they're completely opposite.
Now, I would describe the American Revolution in the real sense as a counter-revolution, in that the American colonists were trying to take back what they viewed as their God-given rights from the usurpation by the British monarch and Parliament. That the British monarch had come in and imposed taxes on various goods and services, not just tea, but paper, the Stamp Act, without any kind of consultation with the colonists, without any representation. And the idea was that the colonists asserted the principle that they would be the sole authority when it came to taxes, and that they would make those decisions in an orderly manner through representatives who would then publicly debate them in a form of a Congress, whether it be on the state or federal level. And that's why they eventually set up the Constitution. They also wanted to take back control of their money. The British Parliament had passed a law that said that only Bank of England notes could be used, and then they basically flooded the colonists, creating a depression. And they were like, we want to control the value of our dollar, and we want our continental script, which they immediately set about creating on the day after the Declaration of Independence, on July 5th, 1776. So it was a reassertion of what was viewed as natural rights. It was not a revolution in the sense that they were trying to reorder the universe and change human nature. Now, the people, the Antifa today, are saying the same thing, in that they are saying that American individuals are being unfairly prosecuted, and in this case, predominantly Black men, that they are being unfairly targeted by authorities, and those authorities are the police. And of course, in this terrible case, they were murdered by the police, a policeman, and done so right out in public with someone filming it. And that this is a usurpation of their sovereign rights as citizens. So I'm giving this side of the story. Now, you and I could talk about the fact that there's something else going on, but we have to address the moral and political impetus for this movement, which is actually very American. It's simply saying we're not going to allow authorities to come in and use force on us unnecessarily, and this was that. And especially when they're singling out people based on race, or for that matter, any reason. So, they do make a point there. You and I know that this is something else, and there are other people involved, and this is actually it is revolutionary, not counter-revolutionary. Okay. But we have to address the counter-revolutionary aspect, which is this not a protest against the usurpation of the sovereign rights of a citizen to life, in this case?
Your argument is very sound. However, there's two things that I would say to it. And I want to go back to what you had mentioned earlier about natural rights. Natural rights was a concept that had been around, since the Greek philosophers on up through Cicero, through Aquinas, finally into Hobbes and Locke. Hobbes and Locke had a little different take on natural rights, of course. But Locke, from whom Thomas Jefferson got the natural rights and put it into our Declaration of Independence, was very explicit. And Locke, along with Jefferson and of course the rest of the revolutionaries, said natural rights come from the Creator, not from government. The only role government has in natural rights is to protect those natural rights. They have no right to control or curtail or obliterate them. It's only to protect them. Those natural rights are under the purview of God and our Creator. So we have to look and say, what really formed the United States? We're an extremely unique nation in that prior to our forming, all governments were sovereign. They said, we're going to control your natural rights. Now we go into this. In fact, Samuel Adams mentioned this in his papers in November of '72 when he was writing his letters out to the other colonists and explicitly mentioned natural rights. So we come up to this time, but we saw American people, listen to this, we saw how these colonists viewed law and order. Today, the Antifas, the BLMs, and those who are supporting and promoting them are saying, you take the law into your own hands. You go out, you steal, you loot, you arson, and we will support you because you are fighting for a right cause. We had, in 1770, some British soldiers, and you had talked about this a little earlier, some British soldiers who were being teased, or whatever you might say, by Boston citizens, and the British soldiers lost their cool and they shot. Terrible, terrible thing. 5 people, I believe it was, that died.
Yes.
A terrible thing. And how did the colonists handle this? Did they go burn down Boston? No. They said, we are going to put this into the hands of the law. John Adams, our second president of the United States, one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, along with Thomas Jefferson, defended those British soldiers. He said, because we are a people of law and order. And so there are two distinct contrasts between the revolutionaries, American revolutionaries, and those who are, their real end goal is to destroy that very, very government that was established to protect individual freedoms and liberties and bring about government tyranny once again. And they will use any excuse possible to bring about every chaos they can to destroy it.
Well, look, I mean, their argument is that...
Whose argument?
The Antifa people.
Okay.
Is that the system is so corrupt, and that the killing of this innocent man, George Floyd, in Minneapolis, I mean, even if he was committing a petty crime, it doesn't matter. He was murdered for it, and it was, gross negligence at best. It was a terrible act, and it is part of other situations that have cropped up around the country. There are legitimate concerns. Their concern is that nothing is going to be done to change that terrible system unless they do hit the streets and protest. That's the only way they feel they can get attention in terms of forcing a change. I understand that. I relate to it, actually. It's like, are they going to, is the man going to listen and change his ways by just simply, doing, I guess, what John Adams did, which is go through the court system and try to adjudicate it, which I think has been done? Or is it going to take a little bit more of a direct action, which is what Samuel Adams did in terms of opposing this system, this corrupt system, and trying to get change by taking matters in your own hands? Now, I'm not defending what they're actually doing, which ironically, or maybe not so ironically, is looting and burning black neighborhoods,
Right.
destroying black businesses, killing black people. There's already a death toll. I think it's already up to 5 people who have
Mhm.
been brutally murdered by these, so-called anti-fascist people, when in fact, it's a classic example of inversion. They are everything. Every element of them is fascist. Um, but so I'm not defending them and their actions. I'm talking about the principle here, which is, how do we address this corruption in our system in a way that is going to bring about genuine change and genuine results?
Well, I think that we already have had well, we've had examples of this, and we also very thoroughly understand that those who formed this country had the same exact concern that you have. They understood, because remember, our founders, their biggest fear was government. They understood that government always has the potential of turning into a tyrannical government. And so what did they do? They wrote all of these natural rights. They said, we're going to be free people. And they said, you know what? That's not enough. We must enumerate what we have to protect. And we're going to put into our Bill of Rights very explicitly things that have to be protected. One of those things, one of the very first things they talked about that must be protected, is the ability for the American citizen to peaceably assemble, along with the ability of the American public to have recourse against the government. So they said this is the way to do it. They didn't say the way to do it is to go about and to tear down all neighborhoods and kill people and loot and destroy. They said you go about peaceably assembling, and you also have the right to go ahead and to address directly any of the wrongs that the government has committed.
All right, my guest is Don Jans. The book is Setting Brushfires of Freedom. Uh, of course, Don, you're right in terms of that our system protects and recognizes these natural rights, but they weren't observed, right?
They were not.
And so the question is this a systemic problem? Now, statistics indicate, for example, that police brutality overall and police brutality against minorities has dropped substantially since the early 1970s in this country, and that policemen are doing a much better job of self-patrolling and of being careful and learning how to conduct themselves in the very, very difficult job. And I have nothing but respect for their position. I mean, they get up every morning, go out and risk their lives. They don't know if they're going to come back. They've got families. I mean, I'm not doing it. I can only imagine that it's a calling. I mean, it's a very dangerous job. So I have nothing but respect for them. But the problem is that this particular type of thing happens over and over again. And, we could maybe look at it on a case-by-case basis and say, did this happen because this person was black? I think it probably, in many cases, it did. I mean, there are black men who are reporting that they're stopped more frequently for minor things, or just because they look suspicious, or because they're menacing, because they're big, and they look, people get nervous. I mean, this was what happened in Central Park. I mean, this woman saw a black man. I think he was jogging, he was doing something, and she said, "Oh my God, there's a black man here." And so she calls the police, and he ends up being killed. Yeah, it's, I pass as white, so I don't know what it's like. But I respect the fact that this is something that's happening. And I don't expect racism to disappear. I mean, that's a very bad side of human nature. But I do expect law and order to prevail in terms of respecting individuals and their rights, and not having this kind of thing happen. So while I don't endorse the radical, movement, and I don't think it has anything to do with helping black people. I think it's more to do with a communist insurrection, and it's probably, you've got George Soros's fingerprints all over it, and you've got the establishment who's trying to take out Trump, which is what this is all about. I get that, but we have to, in order to take a look at this, address the thesis, the presentation that this is based on, and do so in a way that's really constructive. So I guess my question to you, Don Jans, is, given the fact that there is evidence of racial persecution, particularly of black men in this country, and that this is an egregious example of it, how do we, as conservatives, as libertarians, as people who do honor our constitutional system, how do we address it?
I think, first of all, we have to do exactly what you're doing. You are recognizing it. You are admitting to it. And then we have to have a discussion. We have to have a conversation. And I think we have to understand that this is a problem. Some white people, for whatever reasons, just absolutely despise black people. That's called racism. There are white people who absolutely despise Asians for no real reason. That's called racism. There are black people who say every white person should be killed. That's called racism. White supremacy, in my viewpoint, is as much of a racist attitude as is any white attitude towards the blacks. We have people who, for ulterior reasons, promote racism of all kinds. Why? Because racism is extremely divisive. Racism is probably even more divisive than is economic differences. And so if I can go and if I can promote divisiveness, which is at the core, at the heart of Marxism, the core of Marxism is to promote as much divisiveness as you possibly can. And we see those who would advocate for Marxism, the Soroses, the Obamas, the Holders, those people are the ones at the heart of promoting this racism. Now, we have to have an honest discussion. Part of the honest discussion is not just to recognize our faults, but to make sure that reasonable people understand what the ulterior motives of those promoting racism really is. And now discussion.
And now, Don, you are getting to the meat of the matter. I mean, this is why I bring you on this show, right? You get things to the point of what's going on, and that is that, yes, they are fanning the flames of racism. They are promoting racism and division because they want to stop Donald Trump. I believe that that's what this is all about. You know, they tried to do it the minute he stepped into office. They made the ridiculous claim that he has something against black people, which is completely absurd. I mean, you know, the New York Times, I understand, went into his business and they did an examination because they were expecting to find a bunch of, you know, white supremacists. And they discovered that his business promotes more minorities to higher levels and more women to positions of responsibility than most businesses, and that there was absolutely no evidence of that at all. So they decided not to write the story. You know, they just ignored it. That didn't work. So then they tried to undermine him with the biggest conspiracy theory that ever has been put out in my lifetime. And that is that Donald Trump is a Russian spy, right? They went back to the old playbook of Senator Joseph McCarthy, except in the case of McCarthy, there were Russian spies in the government, Soviet spies. Yeah, I mean, in a way, he was right. But in this case, they were like using the same model without any meat to the model. They were like, I mean, if you think about how absurd that is, that he's a Russian spy, he's a Russian asset, and they spent enormous amount of money, and they spent 2 years dragging this out day after day. to try to throw mud as much as they could to destroy or to hobble his ability to function. And this was at a time when the country was trying to move forward, and he continued on anyway. I mean, just to recap briefly, I'll remember that night after night, you listen to Rachel Maddow or even the mainstream media, breaking news, and they bring experts on. This is what's going to happen, how he'll be impeached. This is, this is his connections with the Russians. And you had that Schiff out there waving the paper in the air. I have evidence. I have evidence. He still hasn't shown it. Of proof. I mean, then when the whole thing collapsed, they went to the perfect phone call. I mean, and when that didn't work, it was a complete, fiasco. Then they decided to exploit the coronavirus. Now, whether or not the coronavirus is something that was created in a laboratory or it just was natural, I have no idea. But what I do know is that the Chinese controlled the WHO, and they didn't tell the world about it for 2 weeks at a time when people were traveling all over the world and spreading it. And when they finally got to say something about it in mid-January, they said, oh, it doesn't spread from person to person, which was a complete lie. But putting that aside, they're trying to set up committees to see, well, Trump didn't respond fast enough to this. Who did he know? When did he know it? And now it's this. They're back to the race card. They're back to that, indirectly saying, well, he's got something against Black people. And, that's what this is about. That's what they're playing now. This is part 3 or part 4 of the coup narrative, if you will. And by the way, they were conspiring to take Trump out. We're finding out about that now, especially with Lieutenant General Michael Flynn and information that's coming out about that. I mean, this was, they should all be in the can for this. And I hope that eventually justice is served. But meanwhile, they're using the race card like they always do in every election to try to claim that, to gin up their own support. And they're using Black people as cannon fodder. Meanwhile, you're going to have Black neighborhoods burned down. It's just like in the 1960s. I mean, the Black communists, most of whom were white, went in and torched entire neighborhoods that never recovered. Places like Newark, New Jersey, like Detroit, like neighborhoods in Chicago. I mean, they would completely. Philadelphia had a lot of this. They destroyed Black homes. They destroyed Black businesses. They killed Black people, and they wiped out opportunity for a whole generation. And they're trying to do the same thing now. They don't care about Black people. They want to do this because they're insiders and they're globalists, and they want to stop President Trump's agenda to put America first. That's what this is all about.
I think what we have to do is we have to first of all, I believe all of our problems stem from the American people. I believe that we, the American people, were given a country where we were sovereign. And we said, no, we don't want to be sovereign. We want to be servants. And we're going to give our sovereignty back to the government. And we're just going to sit back. And as Jefferson said, if you become uninformed, uninterested, and uninvolved, you will lose your freedom. And we have become a people who are no longer interested, no longer involved. And we have given up our rights in a lot of ways. Now we have to reclaim it. And much of that is what I talk about in Setting Brushfires of Freedom. But let's go back a minute. We've talked today, you and I, we've talked about a couple of different concepts. We've talked about natural rights. Natural rights are key to a free people. A people cannot be free unless they institute and continue that practice of natural rights. What is natural rights? Natural rights is that our rights, our liberties, are not under the purview of the government. The government should not have anything to do with our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, should not have anything to do with all of the freedoms and liberties, pursuit of happiness. That's not under the purview of the government. That's under our control. So we have to understand what truly are natural rights and why are we allowing the government to take over our natural rights. Second thing, we are a republic. We are not a democracy. Absolutely key. In the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, late summer, when those men got together and said, we're going to redo the Articles of Confederation. However, many of them really had in the back of their mind, probably in the front of their minds, that they were going to write a brand new constitution, which they did. One of the key elements that they debated, it wasn't something that was set to the side, it was up and front, and everybody debated it. Are we going to be a democracy? Are we going to be a monarchy? Or are we going to be a republic? Of course, we revolted from a monarchy. And they soundly said, no, we will not be a democracy. We will be a republic. Bear with me. Two reasons. Number one, a democracy is not a dictatorship. Democracy always becomes a dictatorship. Democracy is a dictatorship. A democracy is a dictatorship of the majority who will take away the rights of a minority anytime they want. We saw this with Schiff's investigation. He said no. He said, we are the majority, you the minority, you have no rights. You can't bring those witnesses, you can't question our witnesses. All those rights that are guaranteed to you in the Constitution of the United States, we're taking from you.
It was the ugliest thing.
We are the majority.
It was the ugliest thing I've ever seen, along with the fact that you had those brown shirts with Mueller showing up at a 73-year-old man's house, that being Roger Stone, never charged with a crime before, with a 28-member SWAT team dressed like Ninja Turtles, and CNN out on the front lawn filming the whole thing. And then they knocked down his wall. His wife is apparently blind, or she's deaf. They dragged him out of bed at like 3 o'clock in the morning, to put him under arrest. This is, this should be a sight that all Americans condemn, and we should all be concerned about. But because they're against Trump, the left is like happy, and they're like crowing, and they're upset that the Attorney General has quashed this idea that he's going to be put in prison for 9 years. It's like, oh my God, this is a miscarriage of justice. To just how twisted and inverted everything has become. It's But
Chuck, that was democracy. That was democracy for all the world to see. A dictatorship by the majority telling the minority what rights they can or cannot have. A republic absolutely says all liberties, all rights are guaranteed by a constitution to be equal to all, whether you're a minority of one or a majority of 99%, the others have exactly the same rights and liberties that you have. And this is why we're being told, no, we're going to be a democracy. We're not going to be a republic. I wish the American people truly understood the heart of what they're trying to tell us in these two areas.
Don, you and I are older in age, and so we don't really completely understand or relate to the younger generation coming up. But my sense is that they don't understand what you and I are talking about. They do think that it's a democracy, where the majority mob rules over, everything. And they do think that rights come from the government. What is the government doing for me here? What is the government doing for me there? They don't understand the basic philosophy that underpins our system of government and our life. They don't understand it. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And that's what they've been taught, and that's what they've been told. And one of the reasons they've been taught and told that is because their parents did not say, no, what you're being taught and told is wrong. Because the parents didn't really understand it either. I dare say that the vast majority, now this isn't true of your audience, because most audiences like this are very much attuned to what we are talking about. I'm talking about the general public. If we go out into the general public and we walk down any street in America, And we asked them, what's the difference between a democracy and a republic? And why were our founders so insistent we be a republic? They wouldn't have any idea about what we were speaking.
Well, you know, Don, we've pretty well illustrated what we're up against here, and that is a revolution. How can we start, or how can we further the interests of the counter-revolution that actually was what the American Revolution was? How can we do that now? Is it too late?
That's a great question. Is it too late? And this is a question I'm asked all the time. Is it too late? Our schools are now systems of indoctrination. They're no longer education systems. We have a press that is really propaganda for the left. It's no longer a press. It no longer reports news. It is strictly, not strictly, but for the vast majority, propaganda. Most American citizens have no idea of what's going on or about what we're talking. And our government, many officials in our government, you can see it in New York, de Blasio. De Blasio is a hardcore Marxist. That's what we've elected. Now, is it too late? Well, Samuel Adams during the 1770, after the Boston Massacre and before the Boston Tea Party, remember what happened. John Adams went back to Braintree. John Adams went back and said, hey, this isn't really important anymore. I'm going to go back and farm and practice law. Hancock literally became a right hand of the governor. And you had very, very few people, I would argue perhaps one, that said, no, it's not too late. It's never too late to fight for liberty and freedom. And he set about setting these brush fires of freedom. Now, when we do this, there's a couple of things we absolutely have to do. Number one is we have to understand who and what we are. This is why programs like yours are so critical to Americans, to teach Americans who and what we really are. Why are these things we're discussing important? Second, we have to understand who these people are. They are what I call collectivists. And I wrote about collectivists, if I may, in this book, Two Visions of the Road to Tyranny. Collectivism or individualism versus collectivism. What does that mean? You have to understand it because it's the heart of freedom and tyranny. And we have people in our government who are claiming we must have tyranny. So we have to understand who they are, and then we have to confront them. Chuck, we don't confront them by telling them, oh, you dumb commie, did I tell you something today? What have I done?
You know, it's really shocking how far down we've slid. And I think that this pandemic has been an example of that. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we should go running around and expose ourselves to this terrible disease, especially people our age. You know, we're like, I think it's maybe 99% of people either are asymptomatic or they recover quickly. But when you're up in years, or when you've got a pre-existing condition, that's where you do have to be careful. And yet we have a government that's done the exact opposite. We have a government that has put people with the coronavirus in nursing homes in New York State and several other of the so-called blue states by decree. And the result is that they've killed thousands of people, while the rest of us are in a state of lockdown, and everyone is so frightened. I mean, I can point to this, you know, in my own family, that people, they just won't go out. And when they do, they're washing, and they go to the grocery store. They're like, you know, they're washing them with a mask and with a headgear. And then after they get the groceries, they're wiping everything down. Then they're laundering their clothes, and they're showering, and then they're washing again. They're so frightened that, I mean, I don't, you know, I'm going with it, you know. I mean, even though they watch me like a hawk, fine. You know, I get to sit here on the porch and do podcasts all day. That's all right. But it's disheartening that people are so like cowed and so willing to accept this kind of this really a state of medical, martial law. They won't go out of the house. It's crazy.
And we call Fauci an expert.
Well, the scientists have taken over, and we don't want to listen to our leaders. They get to decide who gets to cover their faces, and you know. And again, I'm not suggesting that people just run around. I mean, it is a dangerous disease, But, my God, I mean, we can take reasonable precautions as citizens without this kind of like,
Yep.
the henny penny. It kind of reminds me of frankly, of the global warming movement too. I mean, the sky is falling, henny penny. This is like the media. Every time the weather changes, we hear this. It's it's a very negative and actually somewhat hysterical worldview that people are embracing, and it's like, I mean, it's really shocking how much that's made inroads, especially among young people, but even a lot of older people that I
Yep.
know are particularly, they're tiptoeing around. I mean, they're uncomfortable in their own skin, actually.
Unfortunately, our American people have been indoctrinated to believe that government is their friend. And in fact, Obama literally said, he said, government is your friend. Reagan said, government is not the solution. Government is the problem. We can go back time after time after time, and we can see where those who favor liberty and freedom say always, always, always question government. Always.
It goes
Never.
back to Thomas Paine, right? Common Sense. I mean, his pamphlet was the biggest seller during the year 1776. It was really one of the moral and political impetuses of the American Revolution. I mean, and that was his whole point. Don't trust government. Don't trust people in power. Limit their power. They're there. That's a structure that you put in place as a last resort, as a structure to protect God-given rights, God-given privileges on earth. We are sovereign. God is sovereign, and we're sovereign under God, not sovereign under the government. But anyway, Don Jans, please let my listeners and viewers know where they can get your book, or any websites you'd like to share, anything else you'd like to share.
Two things. My books are available on Amazon and on Barnes & Noble. You can also go to my website, which is www.mygrandchildren'samerica.com. The easiest way to find it, quite frankly, is just go into any search engine and search Don, D-O-N, Jans, J-A-N-S. And that'll take you and show you different books. It'll also take you I'll show you where my website is. Go on it. And when you're on my website, I would invite you up in the left-hand corner. If you put your cursor up there, you'll see something that comes down that says menu. If you put your cursor on menu, there's a drop down. You can go over and you can see where it says Don Jans Blog. And I would invite you to do that. I write something on that every weekday. And
Excellent.
Sometimes it's extremely insightful.
No, you're a man of wisdom and knowledge and experience, and I'm really glad that you're sharing it, and I feel privileged to have you on, Don. I want to thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much. I always appreciate being on your program.
All right, Don, take care. Have a good one.